Hello, and welcome to the NHTSA webinar, Breaking Barriers to Bike Share, Insights on Equity. My name is Lisa Patterson, and I will be your moderator for this webinar. I am the Tech Transfer and Workforce Development Program Manager for TREC, the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University. TREC houses NHTSA, the National Institute for Transportation and Communities. NHTSA is the federally designated National University Transportation Center for Livable Communities and is a Portland State-led partnership with the University of Oregon, Oregon Institute of Technology, University of Utah, University of South Florida, and our new partners, University of Arizona and University of Texas at Arlington. Our webinars are based on original research conducted by faculty, researchers, and students at NHTSA partner universities. The goal of these webinars is to get useful research results into the hands of practitioners, academics, and other stakeholders. Our speakers today are Jennifer Dill, John MacArthur, and Nathan McNeil. Jennifer Dill is a Portland State University professor and the director of TREC. She teaches courses in transportation policy, pedestrian and bicycle planning, and research methods. Her research interests focus on the interactions of transportation planning, travel behavior, health, the environment, and land use. In general, she's interested in answering these questions. How do people make their travel and location decisions? How do those decisions impact the environment? And how do our planning decisions impact people's travel and location decisions? Prior to entering academia, she worked as an environmental and transportation planner. Our second speaker, John MacArthur, is the principal investigator in current e-bike research at Portland State University. He's been the Sustainable Transportation Program Manager at TREC since 2009 and has undertaken several research projects involving low to no emission vehicle infrastructure in the Portland metro area, as well as a climate change impact assessment for surface transportation in the Pacific Northwest and Alaska. Before joining the TREC staff, John was the Context-Sensitive and Sustainable Solutions Program Manager for the Oregon State Bridge Delivery Program. He earned a bachelor's in civil engineering from Lehigh University and a master's in environmental health sciences from the University of Michigan School of Public Health. And our third and final speaker will be Nathan McNeil. Nathan is a research associate at the Center for Urban Studies at Portland State University. He conducts research around impacts of new bicycle infrastructure and programs on travel behavior and attitudes towards cycling, shared use mobility programs including car share and bike share, and the connection between land use and transportation. Nathan received a Master's of Urban and Regional Planning from Portland State University and studied history at Columbia University as an undergraduate. Prior to PSU, McNeil worked for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York City as a performance auditor, where he evaluated capital programs and contractors. This webinar was pre-recorded, and due to technical difficulties, this webinar recording will pick up on slide 2 of the first speaker's, Jennifer Dill's, slides.
There's been a lot of research on this topic in the past 5 years or so, and most of it, at least particularly in the US and North America, has been pretty consistent in finding that current bike share users are disproportionately white or Caucasian, of higher income, male, and younger, age 25 to 34 or so, is sort of your more typical bike share user. Of course, there are exceptions to that, but that's what many researchers have found. There's another body of research that has looked at where bike share stations are located, and there is a lot of evidence that in many programs, cities in North America, bike share stations are less likely to be located in neighborhoods that have higher shares of lower income residents and higher shares of African American or Black residents. And so that's one of the reasons that a lot of the research has found that the users of bike share are not necessarily representative of the population more broadly. But there's some research also that shows that even when there are stations in neighborhoods with lower income and minority communities, that usage has been lower than at other stations. And that's where our research comes in. And there is an effort underway to address some of these inequities in bike share use. And many of these one big effort is being led by the Better Bike Share Partnership. And that's who we partnered with on this research. So the Better Bike Share Partnership has worked and funded efforts in several cities to try to increase access to bike share and use of bike share amongst a wide range of communities. And in particular, they have funded efforts in Philadelphia and other cities in the U.S. The investments in Philadelphia included many stations in neighborhoods throughout the city, the core of the city, including a lot of lower income and diverse neighborhoods. The funding also includes outreach and education programs, changes to system design, all with this objective of increasing the use of bike share amongst all populations. So the Better Bike Share Partnership, in the first round of grants, it included Philadelphia and 6 cities, and then in the second year, they added 9 cities to the program. The research that we undertook in partnership with the Better Bike Share Partnership and NHTSA was focused on 3 of those cities, Philadelphia, Chicago, and New York, and in New York particularly the Brooklyn neighborhood. So I'm going to briefly go over some of the efforts in each of these 3 cities where we did our research and where the Better Bike Share Partnership was active. So in Chicago, the system is Divvy, and they had a number of engagement strategies, and particularly focused in the Bronzeville neighborhood. The system in Chicago, the overall system launched in 2013, and at that time there were 17 stations in the Bronzeville neighborhood, and then there were 4 additional stations added in 2015. Some of their efforts included a discount program called Divvy for Everyone, where households that are earning up to 300% of the poverty guideline get initially a $5 annual membership, so a significant discount. They, like I already mentioned, they added stations in underserved areas, and they have a very active community outreach campaign partnering with the organization Go Bronzeville. So they have a lot of promoting Divvy, doing group rides, having local events in neighborhoods, and then also partnering with a personal credit building program to reach out to more people. And there is a cash payment option for people who are participating in the Divvy for Everyone, the low-cost membership for lower income residents. So there's a cash payment option, but only for Divvy for Everyone members. In Brooklyn, New York, the Better Bike Share Partnership focused on the Bed-Stuy neighborhood in the borough of Brooklyn, and the partner there was the Bed-Stuy Restoration Corporation, a community development corporation in that neighborhood that's quite active in doing a number of things. And so the program in New York, I think as most people know, is City Bike, which was launched in May 2013. There were, earlier, there were just 10 stations on the edge of the Bed-Stuy neighborhood, and in summer of 2015, 26 stations were added within the Bed-Stuy neighborhood. There are a number of programs that were part of this partnership to increase use of bike share that included a reduced price option for residents of the public housing in New York City, and then also community-based credit union members, and that was $5 a month, which was about 67% off the normal price. Again, they added stations in the Bed-Stuy neighborhood, and there was a lot of active outreach programs, including special events, organized rides, some targeted promotion to residents of the public housing in the area. They incorporated many of their efforts into a financial literacy program. There was a Prescribe a Bike program at a couple locations, and they did a lot of outreach and also some surveys and focus groups to understand the neighborhood. And then in Philadelphia, Indigo is the bike share system there, launched in April of 2015. There were 17, at the beginning, 17 stations in these targeted outreach efforts in West, South, and North Philadelphia. The system has a cash payment option that is available to anyone. And so that was built into the bike share program from the beginning. They also have a monthly membership as opposed to an annual membership, one way of making it more financially feasible for lower income residents. They have a number of outreach programs, including group rides, local events and meetings, advertising, a digital literacy and bike riding classes. They've also done a lot of surveys and focus groups to really understand the residents in these neighborhoods. And again, the Community Ambassador Program. They also, there is a discount program that is open to people, PA Access cardholders. So those are folks who have cash assistance, SNAP, and medical assistance benefits. And that is $5 a month. So those are just a brief overview of the efforts in each of the cities. And then our research is a three-part research effort. The first part, we surveyed bike share owners and operators about their efforts to address concerns about equity. We have released a report about that, the findings from that, that's available online. The second and the largest part of our research effort is what we're going to be talking about today, and that was surveying residents in these three cities who are living in neighborhoods with bike share stations, in neighborhoods that are predominantly people of color and have relatively high shares of lower income residents. And so we surveyed residents to learn from them their opinions about bike share, whether they use bike share, barriers to bike share, and bicycling in general. And we did that in the summer of 2016. We also, in the three cities, did surveys of users of the bike share system, and particularly users who were taking advantage of some of the programs that I mentioned, such as the discounted memberships. We will be publishing those results a little later this year. But again, today I'm focusing on the survey of residents, and that report is also available online. And so we have a lot of findings. I'm going to warn you, we're going to cover a fair amount of them today. But we also, everything is available in the report, so if there's more details that you don't see, you can check the report that's available free online. So going into a little more detail about how we actually did the survey. It was a mail-out survey to 18,000 residents in those three cities. People living within a quarter mile or less of a bike share station. They were randomly selected in those neighborhoods. The surveys were mailed, but there was an option to complete the survey online, if that was easier for people. We did do a pilot test of the survey in each of the cities to test what response rate would be and to just make sure that the survey was understandable, and also to test out some different incentive options. There were incentives to complete the survey of transit passes or tokens worth roughly $5 to $6 in each of the cities. These maps show where we conducted the survey in the three cities. So in Chicago, this is the Bronzeville neighborhood. that was targeted for the Better Bike Share outreach that I discussed. We surveyed residents in that neighborhood. We also surveyed residents in a neighborhood just south of there as a control, so that's a neighborhood that has the bike share stations but was not targeted for some of the outreach efforts. In Philadelphia, we surveyed in 3 neighborhoods surrounding the core of Philadelphia, and all 3 of those areas were targeted for the outreach programs. And then in Brooklyn and New York City, again, this pink area is the targeted outreach effort in the Bed-Stuy neighborhood with the bike share stations and a lot of these outreach efforts. So that's where most of our survey was conducted. And we did include a control neighborhood just north of there that, again, had bike share stations, but not as much, or not the targeted outreach efforts. So we sent out 18,000 surveys. What happened? We did get a response rate of about 10.5%, which is about what we were expecting. And you can see there the number of responses from each city, and that totaled 1,885 responses. And anywhere from 23% to 31% of the responses were over the web, and the rest, about 2/3 or so overall, were mailed back surveys. So who responded? Overall, our responses reflected the demographics of those neighborhoods fairly well. And so what this slide is showing, the darker bars are the demographic characteristics of our respondents, and the lighter bars includes data from the census, the American Community Survey from 2015. So that represents the population of the neighborhood. So you can see in all 3 cities, the majority, at least 2/3 or more, of our respondents and of the population in general are non-white or Hispanic, so people of color. Our respondents did tend to be more women than men responded to the survey. I mean, more women than men are living in the neighborhoods, but also they were more likely to respond to our survey. In terms of income, overall we did a fairly good job of getting responses from lower income residents. You can see particularly in Chicago and Brooklyn, our responses match the income distribution of the neighborhoods fairly well. Not quite as well in Philadelphia, but again, almost half of our respondents had incomes of under $35,000. With respect to age, our survey respondents did tend to be a little older than the residents in the neighborhoods generally, and that's a common thing we see in surveys today. So one of the things that we did, given our the objective of this research, was to figure out what are some of the barriers, what are some of the opportunities to increasing use of bike share amongst a wider range of the population. We focused in on a subset of our respondents. So first of all, what we are presenting today and what is the focus of the report, first of all, we focused in on adult respondents who are able to ride a bike and who are under the age of 65. So physically able and under the age of 65, because we felt that these are most likely the targets for bike share riding. Now we do in our report have a section where we analyze the results from the survey respondents 65 and older. So we do have findings, though that population is very different from the under 65 population. So we did not want to analyze them together. The other thing that we did, I will point out, some of our respondents were in those control neighborhoods that did not have the outreach efforts. We are not in today's webinar presenting results that include that sample, but again, there's analysis of that in the report. What we're focusing on today is this sort of the part of the circle that is darker in color. And what we did is we divided these respondents into 4 groups based on income and race ethnicity. So we have 18% of all of our respondents, you can see, were lower income people of color. And lower income is defined as below 300% of the federal poverty guidelines. And people of color includes Hispanics and any non-white respondents. And so that group represented 331 of our respondents. Then we have higher income people of color, which we had 212 respondents in that category. Sorry about that. Lower income white respondents was a small group. We had only 45 respondents in that category. So while we present those results, I would not focus on that group too much because of the small sample. And then we had 191 higher income white respondents. So those are the 4 groups that we are using to analyze our results. To give you a little bit to give you a sense of some of the characteristics of those respondents, and particularly on some factors that might affect their use of bike share. Here we have the share of those respondents who have a driver's license, a transit pass, a working bicycle, and a car available for use. And you can see, for example, that the lower income people of color who responded to the survey, only about half of them have a driver's license, and similarly only 30% of them have a car available for use. Whereas our higher income people of color and higher income white respondents, 70% of them have a car available for use. We also see major differences in whether or not they have a bicycle. Only 17% of the lower income people of color did. And you can see transit pass possession is fairly high amongst everyone. And then finally, in terms of background demographics, and particularly important with respect to bike share, the lower income people of color who responded to our survey were less likely to have a smartphone. Only 2/3 of them have a smartphone. Only 43% of them have a credit card, 70% a debit card, and only 56% have reliable access, much lower than for all of the other respondents. And those are important factors when designing and operating a bike share program. With that, I am going to, we can answer any clarification questions, and then I'll turn it over to John MacArthur.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. As we switch it over to John, there is one question so far, and that is regarding the target cities that you had. So let me bring that up here. So if one is under 3% or 300% under the poverty line, why even charge $5 annually? $5 came up in both Chicago and Philadelphia. Is that a legal sweet spot to tap into another public service to share the cost burden, or is a fee charged to buffer the public perception of it being free to a select group?
Ooh, I don't know if there's evidence that that's a particularly sweet spot, I think was the word. I don't think I want to speak to the motivations of the cities in terms of why they chose the $5. But more broadly, you know, there's some evidence, not just for bike shares in particular, but some evidence that sometimes it's worth charging a small amount so that people are invested in the program. But I don't want to speak about the motivations of the 3 cities. But if either of my co-presenters want to chime in on that, feel free.
This is Nathan. I'll just add one quick thing to that. which is that not speaking to the cities themselves, but in looking at our data and why we chose to use the 300% as our breakdown between the lower and higher income groups. We did do some testing, and we saw that we did see more similarities kind of below the 300% and above it. You know, so, or I should say, we saw differences between those groups, and you know, it seemed like in terms of some of their self-perceived ability to manage on their incomes and some questions along those lines, that those numbers did look to us to be, you know, a good way to break it out in terms of our analysis. So I'll just end it at that.
Great. All right, John, we will hand it over to you now.
Thanks. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about bicycling in general, the respondents' views of bicycling, their perception of bicycling and thoughts about bicycling, and then kind of the breakdown of the groups that Jennifer stated. Prior to asking questions about bike share, the survey included questions about respondents' views on transportation services and planning in their neighborhood and their views on bicycling in general. Overall, agreement with positive statements about bicycling was generally quite high. Around 90% agreed that getting people to ride bikes was good for the environment, would help make the community healthier, that the city should invest in bike-related projects such as bike lanes, and that riding a bike is a convenient way to get around. When asked about current riding behavior, white respondents were more likely to report riding a bicycle in the past week, particularly when specifying for most trips. Only 4% of lower and higher income people of color stated they biked for most trips, compared to 13 to 20% lower and higher income whites. Responding about recent and planned intentions to bicycle more often, people of color were somewhat less likely to want to ride more. 58% of those higher income and 62% of those lower income people of color versus 65% overall. That's the full population of the respondents. Lower income people of color were less likely to plan to ride more in the next year, 52% versus 57% overall respondents. Higher income white respondents were more likely to state that they would like to ride more. That's 80% compared to the 65% of all respondents. So this slide kind of talks about the barriers to bicycling, which we asked about. Respondents were asked to consider a variety of potential reasons for not bicycling. For each potential barrier, they were instructed to indicate whether it is something that keeps you from riding a bike or from biking more. Response options were not a barrier, small barrier, big barrier, or does not apply. The percent of respondents selecting big barrier for each statement are shown here and broken down by theme. These themes that we group the questions around are from top to bottom: safety, costs and perceptions, logistics, physical ability, and finally image and appearance. Fear of traffic stands out as a major barrier for nearly half of the respondents. This is the top bar. The next highest is destinations being too far to travel by bike, which is the top bar of the third section, and both are highlighted in blue here. Several of the barriers that ranked highly for many respondents concern issues related to personal bike ownership, including not having a bike or related gear, which was a big barrier for 35% of all respondents. not having safe places at home or at destinations to leave a bike, which was 26 and 34% respectively. Difficulty of carrying things on a bike is 29%. And also, if you notice, not highlighted, but carrying kids or dealing with kids was 27%. So kind of the same thing, carrying things. And the cost of buying a bicycle or related gear being prohibitive, which was 28%. One approach we'll use in this webinar to demonstrate some of these differences between race and income groups will be to show the overall percentage indicating that the item was a big barrier, as you see with the gray bar on the left, and then showing how each of the 4 race and income groupings differed from the overall average. For each question, if the group's bar extends to the left of the 0% axis, that indicates that fewer respondents in that group listed the items as a big barrier compared to the overall average. Whereas the bar extending to the right indicates more people listed this as a big barrier. The biggest barrier to bicycling generally is concerned about traffic safety, regardless of race and income. Nearly half, 48%, of residents cited this as a big barrier to riding a bike in their neighborhood. Those concerns about safety may be compounded for respondents of color, lower or higher income, as they were much more likely to cite travel distance as being too far to go by bicycle. That's 40% to 44% compared to 17 and 23% of white respondents. It is unclear whether the places they travel are actually farther away or if it reflects a difference in perceptions of bikeable distances for these groups. And this is certainly something that should be explored in more detail in future work. For people of color, personal safety is also a concern. Race is an important factor in whether respondents feel their personal safety could be compromised, either as a victim of a crime or as a target of police attention. For people of color, being lower income further exacerbated these concerns. For example, 22% of lower income respondents of color stated that a big barrier to biking would cause them to be harassed or a victim of crime. This compared to 17% of higher income people of color and 7% of higher income white residents. While a smaller share, around 11%, of low income respondents of color cited being a target of police attention as a big barrier to bicycling, this is still higher than higher income people of color, which is only 6%, and higher income white residents, which was only 1%. Concerns about not having safe places to store a bike were also somewhat common, though less common among higher income white respondents. Lack of a bike or related gear is a big barrier for low income residents. Not having a bike or related gear such as a helmet, a lock, or lights was a big barrier for these respondents. The cost of buying these things was cited as a big barrier for 41% of low-income people of color and 37% of low-income white respondents, which is much higher than the higher income respondents, which is around 13 to 17%. Finally, we use this word cloud graphic to highlight the barriers to bicycling. This visualization presents some of the data we've been discussing in the last couple slides, with the font size representing the share of respondents in each group indicating the importance of the big barrier to bicycling. You can clearly see that issues with traffic safety is a big barrier across all groups. In addition, people of color and low-income whites have more barriers to bicycling than higher-income whites. Here we have taken the graphic and only highlighted the barriers to bicycling that bike share might address. Barriers that barriers that are not likely to be addressed by bike share programs are grayed out. Bike share may address many of the major barriers to bicycling for these residents. Some of the most common barriers to bicycling cited by lower income people of color included not having a bike or related gear, not having a safe place to leave a bike at their destination, the expense of buying a bike or related gear, not having a safe place to store a bike at home, not knowing a place to get a bike fixed, and worries about something going wrong with a bike, such as a flat tire or broken chain or something like that. Nearly all these barriers were more significant for lower income respondents of color than other respondents, and many were among the top barriers to bicycling. They are all barriers that can be addressed by bike share. I think both these slides are very interesting. Not only does it show that as you are looking at expanding bike share and doing outreach in the communities, you can break down some of these barriers, but also it also points to the importance of bike infrastructure and the perceptions of safety that these communities need to have in tangent to rolling out bike share in their communities. So with that, I'll take any questions, or we'll move on to the next section.
Great, thanks, John. It looks like we just have a few questions, but they're a little more holistic, so I'll wait until the end, and we will switch it over to Nathan to continue to discuss the results.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, John and Jennifer. I'm going to focus now on the questions on our survey that focused on bike share specifically, and looking at some of the experiences that people have had, their knowledge about the bike share system, and then some of the barriers that we observed or that they told us about in terms of using bike share. First, in terms of the experiences that people have with bike share, so currently bike share is not a common transportation option for lower income residents in these underserved communities. Overall, 4% of our survey respondents were members of their city's bike share program at the time of the survey, with significant differences depending on race and income. So only 2% of lower income residents, whether white or people of color, were members, compared to 5% of higher income people of color and 10% of higher income white residents. Compared to the actual number of residents compared to the number who are actually bike share members, higher shares have actually ridden bike share at some point in their city. So for example, 9% of lower income people of color, 18% of higher income people of color, and 13% of lower income white residents and 29% of higher income white residents had ridden a bike share bike at some point. So it does suggest that people of color and lower income residents may be more likely to be casual users when you compare the rates of membership to the rates of use, or to the rates of people that have ridden. And let's see. And then let's go to the next slide. There we go. One of the things that we thought was interesting was that when we ask about people's expectations and plans for using bike share in the future, some of those differences actually evened out a bit. So we actually saw no significant differences between these groups when we asked about whether they expect that they'll be bike share members or pass holders a year from now, and if they plan to ride a bike share bike in the future. So as you can see, around 10 to 13% of our respondents said that they expect to be bike share pass holders or members, and around 40% said that they plan to ride a bike share bike at some point in the next 6 months. So that was interesting to think about. You know, looking forward, people do have interest and plans to use it, and so there may be opportunities if you can address some of the barriers and the reasons why they're not using it now. One of the things that we did was we asked residents some questions about bike share and to get their sense of their opinions and how they view bike share overall. I'm going to focus on, I know this is a pretty small font and maybe hard to read, I'm going to enlarge some of them and focus on some of the differences that we saw. But what we see here is on the left-hand side are the higher income white respondents, which are kind of the, as Jennifer had mentioned at the beginning, are perhaps the more typical or stereotypical bike share user, and on the right are lower income people of color to kind of contrast how these groups may be similar or different. First of all, we did see that a high percentage of people, regardless of what race and income group they were in our survey, felt that bike share was good for the city, it was good for their neighborhood, and that it was a good alternative to public transportation. Still pretty high up there were this sense of that it was getting better at serving people like me, that it was a good way to get to public transportation. That people, let's see, that there's a focus, so 75% of the respondents in the lower income people of color group said there's a focused effort to make bike share better for all residents, and that was not different from the overall, the overall rate of our respondents. And 74% in that group said bike share was useful for people like them, which is just about the average across all of our respondent groups. And then finally, we did see a little bit more, some hints at some higher rates of negative perceptions about bike share. So, for example, there was 27% of the respondents in this lower income people of color group said that bike share will make it more expensive to live in my neighborhood, and 25% said the stations take space that could be better used for other things. So, I think that when we see this, the difference is notable, that it is higher amongst lower income respondents of color, but still kind of only a quarter of the people that we surveyed indicated these, that they agreed with these statements. So it's not high overall, but it's something that needs to be considered, that it is higher amongst these groups. And finally, I'm gonna move on. We did ask people just how much would you say you know about, and then where it says BSS name, you can fill in the bike share system. So in Indigo, it would have been Indigo in Philadelphia, City Bike in New York, and Divvy in Chicago. Overall, most residents had received some information about the bike share system. However, 16% of those surveyed overall, and 25% of lower income people of color told us that they knew nothing about the system. So there's a good chunk of people that just don't feel like they have information about it. As you can see, the next groups over are know some things about it, know quite a bit about it, and know a lot about it. And those differences carry over to those other groups as well. To get at a little bit of this specific type of knowledge that people had about the system, and to start to think about some of the potential misconceptions that people might have, we asked a series of true-false questions and presented them, as you can see on the screen there. These were a little bit different from city to city, so keep that in mind. But basically, what I'll show in the next slide is these grouped into respondents that answered either definitely false or probably false, and then those that answered probably true or definitely true. And we took those and looked at the percent that answered the question correctly based on our understanding of the way the system operates in that city. And then we also looked at those that had no idea, in part to just get a sense of do people feel like they know about these systems? So to look at some of those overall responses, so on several questions, there were quite a few people that indicated that they had no idea about the truth of the statement at all. So that's the middle row in that bar. And so, on some of those, for example, a reduced price pass is available. 63% of our respondents said that they did not know about the details of any sort of reduced price pass. So that's something that is notable. We also, what I want to do also is break this down by our race and income groups. And looking at these pie charts, this shows the percent of the respondents that answered each question correctly, based on the four groups that we've used in the discussion so far. And then highlighting a couple of areas here. The first are those questions about do you need a credit card to use the bike share system, and particularly looking at those places where you don't, where there was a cash option, and then the availability of the reduced price pass. And as you can see, the percentage of people that know about, know that you don't need to use a credit card when that's the case, or the percentage of people that know about the existence of the discount pass is quite low, and particularly in the lower income groups for the credit card option, and more so in the lower income people of color group for the existence of that discount pass. And then next, looking at some of these potential misconceptions about bike share. Although none of the cities have mandatory helmet laws for bicycle riders, 18% of respondents thought that a helmet was required to use the system, and lower income respondents were more likely to incorrectly assume that a helmet is required to use the system. And then over 1 in 5 of lower income respondents of color mistakenly thought that the bike share bike would lock if they exceeded a time limit. We also saw quite a few people who indicated that they thought a smartphone was required to use the system. These are, some of these are a little bit complicated to parse because, a credit card does make using the system easier. A smartphone does make using the system easier. Many people, a helmet is, often, advisable, or usually always advisable, but none of these are requirements of the system. So kind of parsing what are the requirements and what are the other things that make it easier or better or safer. But we did see some of these potential misconceptions out there. And so I'd like to move on now to what are some of the reasons why people would consider using bike share. And so we looked into the reasons that people would state for why they would consider using it. Survey respondents were presented with a list of 14 potential reasons why they would consider using the bike share system, and were asked to select all that apply. There's also a space to write in another reason or to select nothing. I wouldn't consider using the bike share system. On average, we found respondents selected just over 4 reasons, while 1 in 5, or just under 1 in 5, selected nothing. I wouldn't consider using the bike share system. There's a lot on this slide, and I think we've broken it down into the reasons that were more on the fun and recreation side, and that those are more that are more on the utilitarian side. The 2 most frequently selected options were to get exercise. 62% of the overall respondents selected that, and for fun, 53% of overall the respondents selected that. These were only 2 of the reasons selected. These were the only 2 reasons selected by over half of the respondents. Getting exercise was cited by 71% of lower income respondents of color as a reason why they would consider using bike share, which was a lot higher than all of the other groups. And then as you can see on the lower half of the slide, more utilitarian reasons for using bike share were more commonly cited by white respondents. And if you look across the different potential utilitarian reasons, the trend does show, in many cases, it's a significant difference, which is when it's bolded. But even when it's not significant, there are a higher number of white respondents selecting those utilitarian reasons. So we can talk later about why those differences exist and how they can best be used by bike share systems to target and to kind of market to these communities. But we do see this difference in terms of why people are state that they would be interested in using bike share. And now I'm going to switch over to barriers to using bike share. An important part of this survey focused on barriers to using bike share. Respondents were asked to consider a variety of potential reasons for not using bike share, and for each potential barrier, people were instructed to consider how much of a barrier each would be, with the same response options as John outlined earlier for the bicycling in general, which were either not a barrier, small barrier, big barrier, or does not apply. So on the next slide, we see the overall percent of our respondents selecting each of these potential barriers. And again, they're grouped into categories. We have cost and liability at the top, access and logistics, knowledge and experience, and then kind of more social related barriers. Cost barriers were the most frequently cited overall group, with membership or use costs being too high and concerns about having to pay for the bike if anything should happen to it as the two most frequently cited barriers in that group. I will say on the bottom slide, on the bottom of that slide, the I just prefer to ride my own bike, it was selected by 37% of respondents. Although, whether that's really a barrier or whether it's, that they have other options. So we're not really looking at that as a barrier in general, but just want to point that out, that is pretty high, and but it's perhaps not a focus of this project. And then what I'm going to do is, I know that there's a lot here and this is pretty small font. In the next few slides, we're going to look at a few of these groups in particular and the differences between our race and income groups for each of those groups. So first, on some of our cost and liability related questions, the survey did reveal important differences around cost and liability barriers to using bike share. The high cost of membership was a big barrier for nearly half of the lower income respondents of color, compared to 33% of higher income people of color, 40% of lower income white, and only 18% of higher income white residents. And just so we're clear, those percentages are taking the 37%, which you see for the membership or use costs are too high in the gray bar, and adding or subtracting this difference. So when I say 11% more for the lower income people of color, that means add the 37% plus the 11, 48%. So that's where those numbers come from. In addition, over half of lower income respondents of color worried that they would have to pay for the bike if anything happened to it, and cited that as a big barrier to using bike share. This compared to 31% of higher income people of color, 17% of lower income white respondents, and 10% of higher income white respondents, so a notable difference there. Over 1/3 of lower income respondents of color cited not wanting to use a credit card as a big barrier for using bike share, compared to 21% of higher income people of color and 4% of higher income white respondents. And one of the things that's interesting there is that even though a high percentage of our higher income respondents of color had credit cards, as we noted earlier, there was still a big difference between their willingness to use them and those of higher income white respondents. Let's see. As you can see there, not having a smartphone was cited as a big barrier by 24% of lower income respondents of color, but only 1 to 7% of our other groups. So these, what you can see here is that the concerns about price and being charged for theft or damage or fees to the bicycle are related to both income and race, and kind of you have to take into account both of those to understand what's going on there. Next, we look at access and logistics. One of the things that's notable is that in each of these neighborhoods that we surveyed, we chose them because there were bike share stations in that neighborhood, and that we knew that these people lived near bike share stations. So what we can say is that the city efforts to locate the stations in these neighborhoods have removed or evened out some of the barriers in access for the people in those communities, which makes sense, but it's also nice to see it in the data. And what we saw here was that we saw very few significant differences between the groups in terms of whether there would whether they know where there are stations, if there are stations near where they want to go, if there are stations near their home. And then these concerns about being able to find an available bike. So I think the notable thing here is that the differences are that there aren't differences between the groups. And then finally, I want to look at the knowledge and experience related barriers. So a lack of knowledge about the bike share system was definitely a barrier that we saw. Most notably, 34% of lower income respondents of color stated that not knowing enough about how to use bike share was a big barrier, compared to 19% of higher income people of color and 7% of higher income white respondents. Lower income respondents of color were also significantly more likely to list barriers possibly related to having less experience with the system, such as not knowing if the bike would fit them or feeling that the system was too complicated. And so, this points to a need for greater exposure or experience, or getting the information to people in a way that helps them feel comfortable with using the system and knowing how to use it. Let's see, and moving on, what I want to point out with this slide is, again, we have the higher income white respondents on the left, and the height of each of these statements indicates the percentage of people that stated this was a big barrier for them in using bike share. On the right are the lower income people of color and the percent that stated each of the barriers was a big barrier. What's notable is that across the board, or almost across the board, with one exception, the barriers there were a much higher percentage of people in the lower income people of color group indicating that this was a big barrier. And as you can see, the top one is up there is that I'll worry I'll have to pay for the bike if anything happens to it. Membership or use costs are too high. But really, just the progression of all of the barriers being greater for this group was notable to us. The one that is a downward sloping one, if you can read that, is I just prefer to ride my own bike. And that was cited by 27% of the lower income people of color, compared to 45% of the higher income white respondents. So you'll recognize the format that this is a similar slide to the slide that John showed you of the barriers to bicycling. What it kind of points out is that people of color and lower income respondents, again, cited more barriers to using bike share than higher income white residents. It's perhaps more notable here than it was in the barriers to bicycling slide. And some of the barriers are universal or appear across the different groups, but just the overall weight of the barriers, you can kind of sense that a little bit more, particularly for the people that are in the lower income people of color group. It's a weightier, you get the sense from this of that. So with all that said, we know about some of the experiences that people have had and their knowledge about bike share and some of the barriers that we observed. But then, so what do you do with that information, and how do you start to engage these groups and make bike share better for all the people in this community? So we do have some particular pieces of information that speak to strategies for engagement and what types of sources of information might be the most compelling. And so I'll talk about a few of those in the next few slides, and then we'll open it up for questions. So first, we asked people how they had heard about bike share, if they had, and the N's on the left represent the number of people that had heard about bike share via that means. The highest N, and I apologize, this is down towards the bottom of the screen, is at the bike share station or kiosk, which is not surprising. 444, if you can read that, had gotten some kind of information or heard about bike share through the bike share station. But we wanted to know, based on the kind of source that you got your information from, how did that relate to whether you were more likely to seek more information out about using bike share, to tell someone else about bike share, or to ride a bike share bike? And what we found was, we've charted out the percent that said that they were very likely to do each of those things. and compared to the sources that they had listed as where they'd gotten information. And as you can see, talk to someone from the local partner or gotten information at a community-based center or faith-based organization, stand out above the others. And then some of the other ones, getting information at work or school. What these suggest to us is that some of these more personal types of outreach, while they may be harder to actually make contact and to have that sort of personal contact, there is some evidence that they may be more convincing to people, or may make the reality of using bike share a little bit more tangible to these people. So it's something that could be explored a little bit more, but it stuck out. And then if you compare that down to that at the bike share station or kiosk, which had 444 people selecting it, a much lower percentage of people that if that's where they got their information, they were not as likely to tell us that they planned to ride a bike in the next, I believe it was in the next 6 months. So just it's something to chew on there. And moving on, we also asked about a series of programs or interventions and asked about how, whether they would make them more likely to use bike share. So moving on to some of those possible program changes. The options that we asked about are on the left-hand side there, and the top one that people said would make them much more likely to use bike share were free transfers between public transportation and bike share, followed by discount memberships or use options, more short-term membership or pass options. And that's, in a sense, some of those things are not surprising because the cost of the system was one of the biggest barriers for many residents. But what I want to do is break this down into the race and income groups that we looked at, and to see some of the differences based on those groups on how they responded to these. So that's what we have shown in this slide, which one of the things that you'll see is that that the lower income white group stands out on the the interest in the free transfers between public transportation and bike share, and the more bike share stations where we want to go. As Jennifer had mentioned, it was a small sample size, and so we don't want to extrapolate too much from that, but it does stand out. And then to highlight just a couple other areas here, the option to sign up or buy passes at a store instead of online, and an easier way to pay with cash. One thing that you'll notice about those bars there is that the lower income groups, whether people of color or white, stand out as being more responsive to those changes, and regardless of race, it appears that income is a motivating factor for those. And then the next one I want to point out is looking at some of these more social types of changes or programs. So if more of my friends or family could use bike share with me, organize rides for people like me, and if bike share users were more diverse. For these ones, we do see that those are more appealing for people of color than for the white respondents, and particularly for the lower income people of color. And so it kind of points out that you can target for these groups, and there may be different interests that if you ignored these, you might be missing out on a segment of the population. And so let's see, I have so I'd like to then move into a few concluding slides and then open it up for some questions. So one of the things that we saw in our results was that we saw considerable similarities across the 3 cities that we surveyed. There were a few differences, and we discussed those in the overall report. But overall, we were surprised at how similar these different cities aligned in terms of the percentages of people selecting these barriers versus these ones, or the opinions. So there was. It tells us that we think it could be extrapolated to other cities and be useful information. In terms of the race and income effects, we found that they often influence responses to bicycling and bike share in different ways. differences in behavior and opinion, sometimes correlated with income, sometimes with race, and sometimes with race and income combined. And as you saw with some of those barriers, the lower income and people of color groups kind of compounded to make those barriers even greater than they would be just based on income or just based on, if you're just looking at race. And then, looking at what are some of the key barriers that we saw, we see that cost is still a key barrier, and concerns about fees and liability were considerable, particularly in this lower income people of color group. Knowledge about how to use bike share, and also about the existing discounts that are available. All of these cities had discounted options, but not everybody knew about them, and so getting the word out about that and making sure people know that they are eligible and here's how you sign up is an important existing barrier that, as some of our data seems to indicate, it's that personal contact that may be most effective in kind of connecting the information and about the existing programs to the people that they could help, but that's hard work to do. And then finally, traffic safety is the highest barrier across all groups and has to be addressed if these bike share systems are going to be successful in these communities. And then finally, in terms of outreach, the needs are to spread information about the existing programs and to address the misinformation that may exist. And I think to make people familiar with how to use bike share, and to make sure that they're that they know someone who knows how to use it. They've talked to somebody that knows how to use it, so that it's these concerns about bike share being too complicated. It may be just not having done it or not having a friend that's done it. So kind of addressing those sorts of challenges. And with that, I would like to open it up to questions. And before I get too far into the questions, I do know that I had spoken with someone here in Portland who has has been working on bike share equity and has addressed some of the concerns about liability and fees associated with bike share. And I don't know, Lisa, do you know if Ira is on the line, or Ira, if you are, maybe you could.
It does not look like he is on currently.
Okay. Well, what I'll just say is that in Portland there has been an effort to make it so that fees are not charged. Overage fees, for example, are not charged to people that are participating in the Bike Share for All program. And what they they did find that a greater number of people were interested in signing up after they knew that they weren't going to be liable for for overage fees. And what I thought was interesting in my discussion with Ira was that he also indicated that in their workshop that they have for new Biketown for All members, just by explaining that they are expected to adhere to the time limits, even though they're not being charged extra if they go over the time limits. People were quite responsive to that, and it addressed most of the issues of people keeping the bikes out longer than they should have.
Great, thanks, Nathan.
Yeah.
Ira actually is on, so I
great.
can unmute him, and if he wants to add anything.
Here's the number, if you like it.
Ira, are you there?
Hello?
No.
Oh my goodness.
I hope that I did an okay job of explaining your experience, but if you have anything to add, please.
Put you on the spot there.
I know. It says phone call. Can we go switch to phone call up there?
Oh, it looks like they're having issues with their audio.
Well, if you want to add anything, Ira, feel free. You can add it into the chat, or if you want us to share anything with the group, you can send us an email as well. So we can do that.
Great. All right, well, we can head into the questions. Thank you, Jennifer, John, and Nathan. For those viewing the webinar, please feel free to continue to submit your questions if you have them. It looks like we have a few questions already from the audience. All right, so I'm curious why image and perception was a category that wasn't explored to a greater degree. The infrastructure obstacles are obvious, but in a place like Portland, for example, with good infrastructure, a popular critique of cycling in general is that it is a white culture activity. It would seem this would affect use of bike share as well. How did or didn't such as cultural preference play a part in developing this survey?
So, Lisa, this is Jennifer. I'll step in because I know Nathan's been talking, and I saw this question and looked at some of our survey data, and then Nathan or John can chime in. We did ask several questions on the survey about bicycling generally and bike share in particular. So that tried to get at some of these perception questions. So, for example, we had a question of about barriers to bicycling broadly. We had a question about people might think that I can't afford a car. Riding a bike is not viewed as a cool activity by my friends. Riding a bike could mess up my hair. It might aggravate personal health issues. That's not really a cultural one. But one thing is we found that these actually were not very big barriers for very many of our respondents. And so it did not rise to the level of many of the other barriers. So for example, overall, only 4% of our respondents said that people might think that I can't afford a car was a big barrier to bicycling. Now that was higher, so 10% of our lower income people of color, for example, cited that as a big barrier, and that was more than the other respondents. But it didn't rise as high as we might have expected. We also had another question, a broader question, sort of an agree to disagree scale of I often see people like me riding bikes in my neighborhood, and we're trying to get at that, some of those sort of social cultural issues. And 76% of our lower income people of color said that they often see people like me riding bikes in the neighborhood, and that was a bit lower than our higher income white, but still it was a large majority of the population. So there may be issues that we didn't capture in our questions, but in general I would say those issues didn't rise quite as high as the others.
Great. Nathan or John, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Jennifer did a great job of explaining that, and I think so we saw some indications, but we also we saw the support, as Jennifer mentioned, in terms of people viewing it as something that's useful for people like me. So it is something that we could explore more, or that could be explored more, but we didn't see a lot of indication of that was a major barrier, or so yeah.
And I'll just add that all this stuff is discussed in the report in more detail, and particularly broken down by age and gender, and between each of the cities themselves. So you can explore that within the actual report.
Okay, great. So the next question we have here is, how do you think this data can inform the new dockless model of bike share?
Okay, this is Jennifer. I'll chime in. Since I had plenty of time to read these questions and think about them while Nathan was talking. Obviously, we didn't research any areas with dockless systems, but one of the things that Nathan showed in his slides was that the station is a big source of information for the residents, and it was the top source of information for a lot of our respondents. And so not having that station with the signs, with information, I think could be a problem, because obviously information, not knowing how these systems work, is a big barrier for lower income and people of color in these neighborhoods. So I think it could be a problem. There are perhaps ways to overcome that, but we haven't thought that through yet. John or Nathan, do you want to add?
This is Nathan. I would just add that you know, some of the top barriers that we mentioned aren't going to be all that different for dockless systems. So, you know, cost being a key barrier, concerns about fees and liabilities and liability, knowledge about how to use it and familiarity with it. These are things that you know, the dockless systems, you know, they have some different features and you know, operate a little bit differently, but they still would have to consider how are these things going to affect these communities, and you know, so yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities in some ways in terms of how they would operate.
All right, great. So the next question is, I believe you mentioned credit building as an option for payment participation. Can you describe this? Also, do you have any resources to suggest for looking into best practices in cash payment?
So in terms of credit building, I do know that in New York City, one of the options for the discount membership was by getting a membership with a credit union there and paying through the credit union, and or signing up and getting a credit card or debit card through them. And so that does contribute to that idea of you know, credit building and getting a history there. It's not something that we looked at in depth or really at all in this study in terms of what impact that might have. And can you remind me what was the second part of that question, Lisa?
Resources for best practices in cash payment.
So that is a good question. It's not something, we haven't put anything like that together, but I will say that, you know, Philadelphia was one of the first cities to explore and develop a cash payment method, and it's something that's been replicated in several other cities. They've you know, put together a system through, I think, well, originally Pay Near Me, and I think still Pay Near Me, where people can sign up and online and get basically a slip to go pay at a local convenience store or a grocery store. And my understanding is that that is a pretty convenient system, although it does involve several steps. So I would recommend consulting with one of the cities that have done that. And I think that they are looking at ways to make it kind of smoother and flow better. So, and I think probably have made some advances there as well.
Great. All right. In the slides, I see there's a call for more community engagement. Do you have any suggestions of what form that should take for communities of color?
So, as we had had shown in one of our slides there, you know, some of those more personal types of contacts did appear to be, you know, more convincing. You know, having talked to somebody from a community organization about bike share, or getting information at work or school. You know, I think that engagement that takes bike share and brings it from abstract to reality a bit more, so kind of making it seem less like something that somebody else does and something that I might do, seems to be like a big part of, you know, what constitutes successful engagement. But what we also saw was that, you know, sorts of more personalized kinds of interactions are, you know, they're less they're harder, they're less frequently cited by our respondents, so there are fewer people that are having those kinds of interactions. One piece of information that we have mentioned in we put together a summary report on this project, and we've hinted at a few of the findings that we'll be releasing in our future rider survey. Is that bike share users, so amongst bike share users, people of color were less likely to have friends or family that had used bike share before them, and less likely to know people that used it. And so I think overcoming some of those barriers in terms of if you don't know someone that uses it, you might be less comfortable with it or less likely to try it, or less less likely to be in a situation in which someone would say, hey, let's try it. And so overcoming that kind of lack of personal connection to the system is a challenge. And so if you can get so you got to start somewhere, and start increasing the number of people that the kind of the contacts that people have with the system in a way that makes it real to them.
This is John. I'll just add real quick is one of the things that we saw was that purposes for recreation was also cited as a particular interest for lower income people of color or just lower income, and I guess developing outreach programs that encourage people that bike share can be used for recreation and kind of get them their first steps into using bike share that way, and then allowing them to explore the other kind of ways in which they could use bike share for other types of trips is another way you could develop an outreach program for those communities.
Great, thank you. And we did get a message here from Ira in response to Portland's bike share, Biketown. For all memberships, we removed fees associated with off-rack or out-of-service area parking, and then in doing so, they found that people were more willing to sign up. So thank you for sharing that, Ira. We have another question. Do you know of a community where the bike share program started by catering to the needs of the lower income community first? Maybe this approach is too much of a retrofit, if you will, or one type of program.
Yeah, so I would say that the more recent systems have kind of started with a little bit more of a sense of wanting to serve the diversity of their cities more equitably kind of from the start. I think that Philadelphia is one, in terms of our cities that we included, they built equity in from the beginning and kind of focused the station placement and the payment methods and the outreach based on that approach from the beginning. And I do, I mean, it is challenging once the system's in place and you haven't thought about that very much to then add a layer on top of it and figure out how you're going to better serve the city that you're operating in an equitable way. And so I think that's a challenge that a lot of cities are facing, and it's certainly something that I think that the equity efforts in New York and Chicago, at least the ones that we were studying, did come along after the system had been in place for a little bit longer. And there are some of the small differences between the cities that we noted. You can look into the overall report, but there were a little bit more positive views amongst people of color towards the bike share system in Philadelphia, and that may be part of the reason was that it was kind of started with that idea. But I don't think it's not impossible to overcome, but it's definitely very, very challenging to overcome.
Great, thank you. And so it looks like we have time for about one more question, and I think this is a good question to end on. We have an audience member asking for clear recommendations for breaking these barriers and how to tangibly address these barriers. So perhaps each of you could maybe discuss a concluding remark on some of the more of a tangible recommendation of how to break one of these barriers.
I'll defer to Jennifer and John to start, and maybe I'll finish.
This is Jennifer. I'll chime in. I mean, I think one of the things that really stood out for me is the lack of information, and particularly lack of accurate information. Some of the questions that we had about knowledge, so a lot of misperceptions about bike share and just simply not knowing how it works. And I have a feeling most of the people on this webinar, are pretty familiar with bike share, and it makes sense. But if you could stop for a moment and try to think if you had never heard of it before, if you didn't work in this industry, it is sort of a strange concept about borrowing these bikes and how does it work. And so just information and getting information out there, and then those more personalized methods of getting information out there seem to be effective. So the organized rides, the events, the personal contact can sometimes have a bigger effect. And then also thinking carefully about what information do you have at the station itself to address some of these knowledge barriers.
Yeah, this is John. I think what it shows, I mean, we did this, after these programs had been in place for, a year or more, and it just, I think it shows that it's not something that you can just set up one-year program and expect results, that are moving the needle by major blips here. It's that, and even Chicago has dealt with this a little bit on their cash memberships, and that and extending those for another year. Ultimately, they would like to get those people onto regular memberships, but I think for these communities, not only are they you're rolling out a new program, new infrastructure in their communities, but it's a new idea, and I think it takes time and it takes effort, and so you have to be intentional and put the resources and time to make sure it works.
And I'll just jump in with one last thought, which is, and I had mentioned this before, that the cost is something that a lot of people that a lot of bike share systems are addressing and know is an issue. But I think liability and concerns about fees and what people might be on the hook for if they give over their credit card, we saw that as a very significant barrier. And fear that, well, if I give you my card, I might, I don't know what I'm going to be charged, or I just don't want to take that risk. That seems to be a very real barrier, and something that I think there still needs to be some focus on figuring out how to address that in a way that works for the systems and for the individuals.
And this is John. I'll just add one more thing. I have a good friend who does a lot of social marketing, and he, put this into my ear, and it had some effect when I was thinking about this study. Is he says that to actually get somebody to understand social change and behavior, you need to hit them 5 different ways with the same information. So when you're building your outreach programs, just a media blitz might not be enough. You need to, they need to see the bikes on the street. They need to hear from friends. They need to see, promotional information. There has to be multiple hits for those people to, even contemplate understanding what you're trying to get across to them. So in context of bike share, building an outreach program that does that, I think, is one of the ways in which you can get more participation.
Great. Well, thank you again to Nathan, Jennifer, and John for sharing their work. This concludes our webinar. You can view our other professional development offerings on our website at nitse.trek.pdx.edu. And thank you for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day.